So there are some really bright red flags that just began waving in both the Florida House and Senate when it comes to, giveaways to real estate developers and attacks on workers. But also at the same time, Florida's Attorney General and Ron DeSantis' former chief of staff has some explaining to do. We'll get more into all of that in our latest daily update from the Florida Legislature's 2025 legislative session coming up. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular emphasis on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. This is going to be an update from day 50 of the Florida Legislature's 60-day legislative session, although as we sit here today, not clear right at this moment whether or not 60 days will actually be enough to get it done, or whether we should maybe be thinking about it as a 65-day or a 70-day legislative session, or start thinking about a summertime special session in Tallahassee. Who knows? I'm recording this on right around lunchtime on day 51, and as of last check, we have no beginning to budget negotiations between the House and Senate, which is kind of like the main thing that needs to happen and needs to start for them to sort of bring the whole thing in for a landing on time. It's, by no means is it too late. It's late, but it's not too late. We've seen plenty of sessions where it looked like everything was in a ditch, only for them to suddenly get their act together in a 24-hour blitz and put it all back together. So we may be fine. We may not be. We'll know soon enough. But one thing that's clear is they are prepping for an end game in different ways, and a couple of really dangerous ways, in my opinion. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. I want to flag like two bright red flags that started waving in the House and Senate on a couple of issues yesterday, and these involve bills that were relatively narrow that suddenly are being transformed into a landing spot for what I suspect will be some really gross last minute amendments that show up on the floor of either chambers. And so just to sort of set the table here, there's a requirement in the Constitution that basically says every law shall embrace but one subject and matter properly connected therewith. Meaning you can't pass bills through the legislature that have like 85 different things that have nothing to do with each other. And this makes like a pretty subtle thing really important, the title of a bill. So if you have like an act relating to, dentists, that's a very narrow bill as compared to an act relating to healthcare, which suddenly a whole bunch of other stuff could be considered germane, is I think the technical term or the legal term to healthcare, right? And so you're always looking on the lookout for what folks will call vehicles, these bills with really broad titles that can become vehicles for amendments. And so why that gets important is, there's always, all of us are always just trying to figure out what bills are dead. There's so many bad bills moving in the Florida legislature at any one time. It's hard to focus on them all. So you're really anxious to see bills die, not only because they're terrible policy ideas, but also so you can like focus your energies on the ones that really have a chance to pass. But it's always hard to figure that out because of the ability to amend bills that are stuck in committee. Say, you might have a bill going through the Florida Senate where you run into a committee where there's, 8 senators on there. It's a 5-3 Republican majority. If one of those Republican senators is opposed to your bill, suddenly you're stuck, right? But unless you can find some other vehicle moving through the process that you can amend your bill onto and kind of get around that tough vote, get out into the floor of the chamber where there's a much bigger margin. We got supermajority Republican majorities in both chambers of the legislature. You can afford to bleed quite a few Republicans in either chamber and still pass a pretty bad bill. And so I'll give you a couple of examples of where we see this starting to appear. On Monday, so technically, I guess day 49. We'll call this day 49 and 50 update. The Senate, I believe it was the Senate Rules Committee, was hearing Senate Bill 492, which was a bill at the time dealing with mitigation banks. Now, mitigation banks, this is not an area I've ever really cracked into, although I suspect there's probably a lot of bodies buried in that world. But mitigation banks are essentially, when developers are building projects where they're going to destroy a bunch of wetlands, they can buy credits out of mitigation banks to offset that damage, where essentially mitigation banks are restoring some other wetland, usually in the area. So anyway, Senate Bill 492 was making a bunch of changes to mitigation banking, right? So, like I said, I haven't cracked inside the bill. I haven't cracked inside mitigation banks ever. It's possible this was a shady bill to begin with. There's a little bit of smoke around it, but I couldn't swear to it. But regardless, it was relatively narrow at least. But the Senate Rules Committee amended the bill on Monday, and the amendment, as far as I could tell, didn't really do a lot to the underlying bill, but it changed the title from an act relating to mitigation banks to an act relating to land development. And obviously, land development is a much, much broader category. There's basically anything related to growth and real estate and housing and construction. All of that can basically now this becomes a vehicle for anything in that world. And I mention this because we've seen some pretty ugly stuff hung up in committee in the Florida Senate this year. So we did a show. I want to say it was even the first week of session about a bill called Senate Bill 1118, which had an amendment thrown onto it in the first shot where it just loaded it up with a bunch of gross special interest stuff. So among other things, it added language to overturn a rural boundary that had just been approved by voters in Orlando to create like essentially protections for rural areas against suburban sprawl. Passed a local referendum that passed with like 70% support. Language was thrown into the Senate Bill 1118 that would overturn that local election and completely dissolve the rural boundary protections in Orlando, gut them completely. The same bill had language added to it that would steamroll the city of Fernandina Beach, where the chemical manufacturing company, the pulp manufacturing company, Rayonier Advanced Materials, basically a spinoff from Rayonier, the timber giant. It had applied for a permit to build an ethanol plant right in downtown Fernandina Beach, basically, which is like, if you've ever been to Fernandina Beach, I think that's actually my favorite town in all of Florida. It's this old like north coastal town right on the border with Georgia. It's got a really cool vibe to it. Anyway, Rayonier wanted to build an ethanol plant at its pulp mill right in town there, and it got denied. This thing was so unpopular with locals. Mayor of Fernandina Beach that had supported a guy, I believe, if memory serves, worked for Rayonier, got thrown out of office over this issue, right? And so the city council there ultimately denied this ethanol plant, told Rayonier to pound sand. Rayonier has sued, and this language that got added to Senate Bill 1118 would essentially resolve that case in favor of Rayonier. It would essentially force Fernandina Beach to allow this ethanol plant. That's stuck in that bill. There's another provision. I'm actually trying to learn more about this now, but that Lennar Homes is pushing for that would, if I understand it correctly, and again, still learning some of this, would allow essentially developers to like perpetually profit off of home sales and subdivisions. Even long after the subdivision is completely sold out, they could continue making homeowners that bought in there pay this like perpetual fee that gives them just like never-ending profit out of these projects, and that homeowners would have no ability to avoid, and if they didn't pay, would be foreclosed upon. So all of this stuff is in 1118, but once it got into there, it got stuck. That bill has not moved again. But now, suddenly, you've got Senate Bill 492 is suddenly an act relating to land development. So some of all of that language, how much do you want to bet? Some or all of that is going to show up as an amendment on the Senate floor onto this new Senate Bill 492 or some other vehicle moving along the way. This seems clear to me that Senate leadership is trying to give itself some options to stick some of that really gross development stuff onto a vehicle that it can't get through committee the normal way. And we had another example of this happen yesterday on day 50, just to get back on podcast timing here, in the House Commerce Committee. And this involved a bill, a much higher profile, but this was House Bill 1225, which is the child labor bill. I think we've talked about this a few times on this. It's basically a rehash of a bill they tried to pass last year that essentially unwinds a whole bunch of child labor laws. It's like the children yearn for the minds, I guess, in the minds of a bunch of Republican Florida legislators, it seems like. But this would essentially allow businesses to have kids work, high school kids work like 40-hour work weeks or like 12-hour work days during the school year or on school nights, that sort of thing. Just kind of a brazen walk back. This shows you just how poor of a judge I can be of this. I thought the House was going to kill this bill. You might have mentioned we had a podcast a couple of weeks ago where McKenna Schuler, a reporter at the Orlando Weekly, broke the story that Ron DeSantis was actually behind the child labor bill this year. pretty sure he's doing it on behalf of a right-wing billionaire-backed think tank. But anyway, he's the guy that seems to be really pushing it through the legislature this year, at least behind the scenes. And so when that kind of came out, I kind of wondered if the House would kill it the next time they set up for hearing. I was literally I was literally hanging on the vote in that hearing. I was sure it was going down, and of course it passed easily. I'm a terrible judge at predictions. I don't know why you listen to me. I don't know why anybody would watch this podcast. It makes no sense. Anyway, child labor is still moving along, but yesterday in the House Commerce Committee they take it up, and again they amended it to and changed it to an act relating to employment now. And they stuck another provision on there. So in addition to rolling back child labor laws, you folks that pay attention to the newsletter or read a lot might remember like the absolute worst bill of session last year was House Bill 433. This was the bill that essentially preempted local governments from requiring businesses provide heat stress protections to workers working outside. Essentially, this was a big priority of the construction and ag industries that didn't want to be forced to provide like cool drinking water to their employees. That bill also had some language in it that preempted local living wage laws. This is a big deal in Miami, particularly, but lots of communities, big cities. I think Orlando has one. They exist in some places in Tampa, other places in South Florida. Gainesville may have it too, but that require local governments will require their contractors, companies profiting off of doing business with taxpayers, to pay their employees a living wage. That's like a condition of getting this contract. So House Bill 433, among other things it did last year, it essentially obliterated all those local living wage ordinances, dissolved them. But at the last minute, to try and like give just basic appeasement levels to critics, they delayed the implementation of that bill by 2 years to 2026. And the logic was that, if I'm going off memory, but the logic was that's when the Florida minimum wage rises to $15 an hour. And so that's when we're going to have this preemption go into effect. Never mind, it's still a pay cut if you're in Miami, where I believe the living wage gets you either like $17 in benefits or $18 an hour, something like that. So it would still be a pay cut for tens of thousands of people in Miami-Dade County just alone. But still, that was the logic. But now the House Commerce Committee rewrote this bill to essentially pair this child labor rollback with a provision bumping up that preemption to make it essentially immediate. It would take effect this year rather than waiting till next year. Like literally 1 year after we sort of signed off on this, we're gonna get rid of living wage ordinances, but we're gonna wait 2 years and let the minimum wage rise a little bit. They're gonna do away with that. But even more to the point of that is this title change, making this an act related to employment, sets this up as a vehicle for a whole bunch of really gross amendments. So we know, for instance, that the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the big business front group for Publix and Disney and Universal and all these giant corporations, has been pushing language the last couple of years to try and just like totally bind local governments from ever regulating anything to do with terms or conditions of employment. Just make it impossible for local governments to do and local communities to do literally anything to help workers in those communities. That language they have been pushing. Suddenly that's in play now. That could show up on the House floor, and you never even had to have that show up in committee where people could actually testify against it, where you could actually have a chance for opponents to rally opposition to this stuff. This even makes it to the point I was mentioning earlier about trying to figure out when bills are dead. It makes it impossible. Even when bad bills go down, they're not really down when a bill like this is just sort of like a vehicle like this is kind of slowly creeping through the process, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Like if you were looking for good news the last couple of days in Tallahassee, that same Senate Rules Committee on Monday shot down a bill we've talked a lot about, Senate Bill 676, which would essentially create a loophole in the state minimum wage. It would allow employers to pay certain workers less than the minimum wage. We've talked a lot about this. It's incredibly unconstitutional. It was actually a really dangerous bill because it was so clearly unconstitutional in that it seemed to be intended to set up a court challenge of some kind and hoping that the Florida Supreme Court might essentially rip a loophole into the state minimum wage, which is in the Florida Constitution. Anyway, that bill was up for a hearing, and the sponsor pulled it because he did not have the votes. He told reporters afterwards that he didn't have the votes to get through the Senate Rules Committee. Theoretically, that should be it. The Senate Rules Committee is not meeting again this session. That bill should be dead. But now, this minimum wage bill could surface as an amendment onto an act relating to employment now and show up there. So there's suddenly a lifeline available for this through the Senate this way. Similarly, there's another really gross bill that would essentially eliminate a bunch of workplace protections on day laborers and temp staffers. It would eliminate something known as the state's Labor Pool Act. This is a bill that I think caught a lot of like workers advocates by surprise when it was moving through the session, and suddenly it's become like a really big controversy late in session as people kind of realized, hey, this bill just repeals the Labor Pool Act entirely. Anyway, that bill yesterday in, I believe, the Senate Fiscal Policy Committee, the last meeting of the Senate Fiscal Policy Committee got held up, got postponed. It was on the agenda. They did not hear it. Presumably, that should be dead now. But now you're going to have this act relating to employment potentially bouncing back and forth between the House and Senate. You could see that language suddenly surface on that bill, too. They've created this option to do some really awful things for workers at the very last minute now. So these, like I said, these are just giant bright red flags to be paying attention to. When you see late in a session when a narrow bill suddenly has its title changed to something broad, that is a dead giveaway that leadership has something planned for that on the floor. And when leadership has something planned on the floor, it is, in my experience, rarely a very good thing for most people. So the last thing we'll talk about today is I figure we go back through the Hope Florida scandal because we had some more big developments, and I'm particularly interested in this idea that the walls certainly seem to be closing in on James Uthmeyer, who was Ron DeSantis's chief of staff throughout this whole scandal, and is now the state's attorney general, basically the top lawyer for the state. Never elected to that job, of course, appointed to it by Governor Ron DeSantis after he picked Ashley Moody, the elected attorney general, to replace Marco Rubio in the state Senate. And Marco Rubio, of course, doing just a bang up job as Secretary of State for Trump. So for the Hope Florida stuff, just to recap for folks that don't remember the details, essentially the DeSantis administration pressured a state Medicaid contractor that had overbilled the state for prescription drugs. It pressured that contractor into making a $10 million donation to the Hope Florida Foundation, a charity founded by First Lady Casey DeSantis. This was part of a legal settlement, a $67 million legal settlement for that overbilling. And so as soon as Centene made this $10 million donation to the Hope Florida Foundation turned around and gave that $10 million to these two dark money groups. One was run by the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the big business lobby group. It was like, just to set aside, on what scenario does it make sense for a alleged charity meant to help people giving money to what is explicitly been a political vehicle for the Florida Chamber of Commerce? That on its own is bonkers. But anyway, the Hope Florida Foundation takes the $10 million it got from Centene as part of this legal settlement, gives it in $5 million each to these two dark money groups, who then turn around and make millions of dollars worth of contributions to a political committee that the governor had set up to oppose Amendment 3, the ballot measure last year that would have legalized marijuana. So it's essentially like a big daisy chain that seems to have taken $10 million of public money meant for the state's Medicaid program, which provides health insurance to poor, elderly, and disabled Floridians, and turned that money instead into funding for television ads in a political campaign that the governor saw as like critical to his political future, right? Really ugly looking stuff. We can argue. There's a lot of arguments happening. The ground the DeSantis administration seems to be trying to stake out is that it was legal. They're not even bothering with trying to argue that it was appropriate or ethical or anything like that. Still not actually clear that it was legal. That initial step in the daisy chain here, diverting $10 million from a legal settlement straight to this charity, this state-created charity, rather than having it come back into the state for taxpayers and the legislature to decide how to spend, that still seems to be super problematic. The DeSantis administration put out a lengthy explanation of it yesterday, and it was at best a thin legal argument. It was this is one that very easily could end up before a judge for a judge to resolve. Anyway, I say all this is the Tampa Bay Times had a story yesterday that reported that Centene initially proposed this $67 million settlement to the DeSantis administration in February 2022, and that James Uthmeyer, who was then the governor's chief of staff, was directly involved in these settlement negotiations. And I actually found in public records and helped shared them with other reporters, these calendar entries that show James Uthmeyer, while he was chief of staff, meeting with the lawyers that Florida had helped, the outside counsel that Florida had hired to help with the Centene litigation, meeting with Centene and its lawyers and stuff. So a lot of fingerprints that showed James Uthmeyer involved in the settlement discussions on the near end. Fast forward to you get to this point in the fall of 2024 when the settlement finally gets finalized, but now with this added wrinkle of instead of $67 million going to the state directly, it's 57 to the state and 10 to Hope Florida. And Hope Florida turns around and gives that money to the dark money groups that give it to the political committee. That political committee was chaired by James Uthmeyer. But even more than that, who sort of who convinced or who instructed the two dark money groups, that Florida Chamber of Commerce group and then also a group called Save Our Society from Drugs, an anti-marijuana group, who instructed them to seek those $5 million grants in the first place? James Uthmeyer. That has come out in these hearings so far, where the director of the Save Our Society from Drugs group has said James Uthmeyer told her to ask Hope Florida Foundation for $5 million to make a grant proposal, and that he did so knowing that the money was then going to turn around and be given to his political committee, which was called Keep Florida Clean. So this is starting to look really bad for Uthmeyer. And what's been interesting is watching Uthmeyer and his supporters kind of move the goalposts on this, because there was an opinion column written by Alan Lawson, former Florida Supreme Court justice who stepped down to start a new law firm that has been getting a ton of business from the DeSantis administration, called Lawson Huck Gonzalez. It's come up in our radar in Orlando because they got a no-bid contract out of the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, which you might remember as Reedy Creek after DeSantis took it over from Disney. Anyway, Alan Lawson wrote this column defending James Uthmeyer's role in all this, and it had a line in there, as far as I can tell, he had nothing to do with this settlement at all. Well, okay, we know that's not true anymore. We do know he was involved, at least on the front end. And so now yesterday in the Times story, Uthmeyer's sort of taxpayer paid like Twitter troll / spokesman seemed to be trying to make the argument that he might have been involved in the front end, but by the time it got to the details, he had deferred it to other people, and so he had nothing to do with the final settlement and the decision to give $10 million to Hope Florida. As if the argument seems to be that he was involved at first, but then he stopped being involved later. For what reason other than, I don't know, shrug emoji. And also just sort of defies belief that he would not have been very involved with this stuff. This is a guy that, what little we know is that he's very hands-on. I'll give you a couple of other examples. The Tampa Bay Times had another story not too long ago. Everybody listening to this is probably familiar with the state park scandal, where the DeSantis administration tried to help a group build a golf course in Jonathan Dickinson State Park, and then also had plans to build lodges and pickleball courts in other state parks around the state that sort of blew up in controversy when people were just furious at this whole proposal. The Tampa Bay Times reported James Uthmeyer was meeting with these golf course guys like very early on in this process, far earlier before any of it became public. Not too long ago, I did a story looking into the sugar industry is trying to build a rock mine in the Everglades agricultural area just south of Lake Okeechobee, kind of in the heart of the former Everglades. When I was pulling documents on that, trying to understand who was behind it, those documents showed the sugar industry lobbyists and the construction contractor were in this meeting with James Uthmeyer. So the idea that, he was somehow not aware or not involved in this decision to divert $10 million from a settlement to a foundation that immediately gave the money in ways that benefited the stuff he was doing politically, and that he knew to have these groups ask for it, sort of boggles the mind. It'll be interesting to hear the explanations. There are more Hope Florida hearings coming this week, it sounds like, so we might get some more answers. It does seem like eventually there's going to have to be some sort of showdown between the Florida House of Representatives and Uthmeyer at minimum. And of course, Uthmeyer, chief of staff at the time, you're one level below the boss man, Ron DeSantis. So this scandal does not seem to be going away anytime soon, and it's just like the trickle nature of this, the more details just keep trickling out is, if nothing else, it is fascinating to watch and finally see potentially some accountability come into these guys. God knows I've been screaming for months about a lot of the abusive behavior we saw out of the DeSantis administration last year during the fights over the two constitutional amendments, the marijuana one and the abortion rights one. So anyway, more to come on that front, and hopefully it'll be illuminating stuff. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it there. We'll be back again tomorrow for day 51, a check-in for day 51. In the meantime, just make sure to click like and subscribe, maybe leave a comment or review. And if you get a chance, sign up for a subscription at seekingrentsfl.com. Nothing's behind a paywall, but there is that option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you get a chance. Okay, we'll talk again very soon. See ya. Bye-bye.